and the appendix with its separate video. The wrong button. There we go. Chapter 72. Sin and Law. In the latter 1950s, when visiting my father, I found some of his old country friends, fellow Armenians from Van province. Their happy talk turned sombre as they turned to the American scene, Armenian scene. Why you no delete? Their happy talk turned sombre as they turned to the American scene. These were the easy years of Dwight D. Eisenhower's presidency and a relaxed and confident outlook. But these elderly Armenians were full of grief. They saw too well the drift away from Christian moorings into a meaningless and indifferent concern to an economic republic from a Christian republic. Some shed tears as they concluded that the United States could become another Turkey. I was shocked by their outlook. Later, when the presidential election between John F. Kennedy and Richard M. Nixon took place, I was further startled because my father, ill and dying, cast an absentee ballot for Kennedy against Nixon as a protest vote. As a young man in my 40s, I said nothing to the older men, but I do not forget that day. Gradually, I came to recognize the validity of their perspective. The Christian past of the United States was steadily becoming simply that, its past. No more than Rehoboam could count on David's and Solomon's achievements as his personal credit, could 20th century America reckon its past as a present asset. A great revolutionary Pope Gregory VII whatever his errors. A great revolutionary Pope Gregory VII, whatever his errors, was radically right in declaring that what must govern us is not custom nor tradition, but the truth. He held, quote, "The Lord hath not said, I am tradition, but I am the truth," end quote. The best tradition becomes barren and empty of meaning when separated from the truth. The biblical emphasis is radically and totally on the truth, not on tradition. We are not ruled by the sons of Moses, nor by the blood line of Peter, but by the truth of God. It is not a matter of dissent, but of truth. Our forms may be, in church and state, as severely correct as possible, but they are worthless unless the very Spirit of God governs them. The modern age has been full of nonsense from Descartes on. Ludwig Feuerbach, 1804 to 1872, held that, quote, "Being is one with eating. Man is what he eats," end quote. With a background of many such absurd views, the modern era has inevitably drifted from and abandoned its Christian foundations. Having rejected God, it has rejected the doctrine of sin. Sin presupposes God. Sin presupposes God and His law. The sovereign lawgiver decrees what is good and evil, and what is law and what is sin. As Kevin observed, quote, "If there is sin, there must also be law, for sin is the transgression of the law." 1 John 3:4, end quote. To deny sin, to deny that moral offences are essentially against God and His law, is to deny God's law. Crime is essentially against the state and its order. Sin is against God and His law. Men can escape the eyes of the state, but not of God. To abandon Christianity is to embrace statism or anarchism, the sovereign state or the sovereign man. The sovereign God is rejected. The United States, in its drift, has left God's sovereignty for that of the state. It knows no law save that of the state or some international civil order. The lawgiver becomes the new creator. It was said of Ezra Pound, quote, Pound attempted to recreate the whole world in the image of himself and his poetry, end quote. In 1922 in Italy, Pound announced, quote, that the Christian era was over, that the, quote, Pound era, end quote, had begun, end quote. This was entirely logical. If we deny Christ, we place ourselves in a godless world and era, but we do not lessen God nor his law and power, only ourselves. By abandoning Christianity, the United States and other nations have abandoned law and freedom for the anarchy of self-willed men. The Pound era means anarchy and death. Oh, too true. Chapter 73. No law, no morality. We can, with the greatest clarity, say, no God, no morality. Matthew Arnold was foolish enough to believe that God could be dropped from the minds of men, but morality retained. But morality retained. But morality retained. In recent years, the validity of Christian morality has been openly challenged. The ethical standard of humanism is against any universally valid morality. The, quote, values clarification, end quote, courses taught in many state schools insist on every person's, quote unquote, right to create their own personal and private morality. To create their own personal and private morality. Oh, hang on a second. It's not right. Objections to teaching chastity. Objections to teaching chastity in state school, quote-unquote, family courses are at times openly based on the fact that chastity is an emphasis on biblical morality. Humanism demands freedom for a variety of sexual expressions. According to 1 John 3:4, quote, whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law, for sin is the transgression of the law, end quote. Antinomianism, by denying the law, denies thereby the reality of sin. Sin is the transgression of the law of God. If there is no law, there is then no sin. But this is not all. If there is no sin, there is no need for atonement. As evangelicalism has become increasingly antinomian, it has also steadily lost the meaning of Christ's atonement. Instead of atonement satisfying the justice of God by the substitution of the sinless incarnate Son of God as our sin-bearer, atonement has become an emotional event. The evangelical churchmen even referred to the cross as, quote, a great mystery, end quote. They can speak emotionally of the shed blood of Jesus without knowing why it was shed, nor why God's law and justice require atonement. This ignorance has had a shattering effect on the life of faith. The atonement is a juridical act and much, much more. In contemporary evangelical thinking, Christ's death on the cross is limited in its meaning to a purely personal application. That such an application is valid is true only if the theological meaning is maintained. If God requires restitution as the basis of man's relationship to himself, and therefore as necessary for man's relationship in society to his fellow men, Exodus 22, then Christ's atonement is central to the justice system, to man's relationship to God, and to man's relationship to his fellow men. Without this centrality of the atonement to all of life, to our relationship to God and to man, we have no justice in any biblical sense. Justice rests on atonement and restitution, and apart from this, religion and society fall into injustice. Those who insist on antinomianism as the valid meaning of the New Testament, those who insist on antinomianism as the valid meaning of the New Testament do not face up to the requirement of Matthew 15:17-20. Those who, quote, break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so, shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. End quote. This does not speak of antinomians, but simply of any who are set. But simply of any who set aside the least commandment by their interpretation thereof. Those, however, who nullify the whole of God's law, like the scribes and Pharisees, quote, shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. End quote. It is amazing that some men can read this and insist on some alien meaning. How much worse it is when some have actually taught that the law was given by Satan. Almost all these antinomian, quote, Bible teachers, end quote, do stop short of saying that the law's origin was in Satan, but they still treat it as an evil thing too often. In all this, the antinomians are like the humanists who, denying God, deny his law, a logical step. The churchmen who deny the law have in effect denied God also. They forget that the modernists began by challenging and denying the Pentateuch, the Mosaic books, as authentic. The evangelical camp seems to be on the same pilgrimage to unbelief. It's not surprising that the denial of the Mosaic books is commonly followed by an altered view of biblical infallibility. More than a few denominations, seminaries and colleges that began by breaking away from the mainline churches are soon involved in antinomianism and loose views of the Bible and its authority. After all, to reject God's law means rejecting much of both the Old and New Testaments. It should not surprise us that many antinomian pastors and churches have serious moral problems whose roots are in their antinomianism. This should be no surprise. If a church objects to the use of the Ten Commandments in its services, it will logically reject their application in their personal lives. If there is no law, there is no morality. Of the ungodly, David says, quote, there is no fear of God before his eyes. Psalm 36:1, a verse cited by Paul in Romans 3:18 in an important context, the description of the ungodly. Romans 3:10-23. It is a mark of evil that this can be said of so many within the church. Alrighty, let's continue on with chapter 74. Chapter 74, Theonomy versus Tyranny. Man's choice is between theonomy and autonomy, God's law versus self-law. Man, being a sinner, a fallen creature, can only create laws and societies which, in their developed form, simply amplify man's sin. The result is tyranny, rule without God. The power to make laws is the mark of lordship, sovereignty, or explicit or implicit divinity. According to William Pitt, Earl of Chatham, quote, unlimited power is apt to corrupt the minds of those who possess it, and this I know, my lords, that where law ends, tyranny begins. End quote. Edmund Burke, a year later, 1771, said, quote, "The greater the power, the more dangerous the abuse." End quote. Both men made their comments in response to the John Wilkes affair. Wilkes represented the unfettered will of the people as against a still lingering belief in a higher law. The word tyranny comes from the Latin tyrannus. It means normally rule by an oppressive power, but very commonly tyrannies have been popular. Thus, Adolf Hitler was clearly a man with a popular following, as was Mussolini and others as well. A tyranny can be a popularly elected party or group of men, so that a tyranny can exist without a single tyrant. The essence of the tyranny is that no absolute and God-ordained law and justice prevails, only the will of a man, a group or party of men, or a majority or a minority of men. The essence of tyranny is that it represents in some form the will of man, not the law of God. On the other hand, theonomy means literally the law of God. In our time, theonomy represents to all too many people the essence of evil, for the will of man is held to be the source of determination, of law and morality. As various areas of society and its peoples enthrone autonomy, they dethrone theonomy, and they replace God with man. Thus, in one church after another, to all practical intent, God's law has been replaced by man's, and the rules and canons of the church tend to prevail over God's law. In issues relating to sexuality, homosexuality, abortion and euthanasia, this has been especially the case. Tyranny in the church, as in the state, is tied to this substitution of man's law for God's law. Tyranny, rule without God's law, is inescapable where theonomy is set aside. The very statement of the need for theonomy nowadays inflames unbelievers and churchmen alike, and the difference between them is often in name only. The tyrants are earnest men from the days of the Tower of Babel to the present. They believe that they are alone capable of saving the world by means of their planned world order. Implicit in their stand is the belief that the Bible is wrong and Jesus Christ was wrong. As an instructor training course, car salesmen in positive thinking as a means of increasing sales holds, Jesus was a negative thinker and a failure. The 30 tyrants of Greece, pupils of Plato, wanted to save Greece, and they helped to destroy it. Much of the world's evil presents itself as the true good, and a failure to recognize the moral earnestness of evil can be deadly. The new pornography does not see itself as the purveyor of dirty books, but as a source of true enlightenment, as a basis of the liberation of man. Its fervour often is marked by a missionary zeal. Tyranny is increasing the world over. The decline of the Soviet Empire made way for other and more extensive tyrannies. The moral warfare underway is more deadly than nuclear war. Jesus Christ is our Redeemer King, our lawgiver from the foundation of the world. The insane interpretations of Matthew 5:17-20, which seek to separate Jesus from the law, tell us more about the blindness and or depravity of such men than they do about the Bible. But all men must be taught. In Isaiah's words, quote, "For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little." Isaiah 28:10. Okay, well, plenty of time to go, but I'm going to quit it there and give the appendix the attention it it needs. So thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions or comments, that'll be helpful. Yeah. Make comment, make message, be very nice. And if you want to support this work, you can do so by going to nathanteacher.com and clicking on the donate button. That's all for now. So check you all later. See you now.